Welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisen, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And joining us from San Francisco today is Ed Frauenheim. And Ed is the co-author with Ed Adams, two Eds, on a new book called Reinventing Masculinity, the Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. And I would say that this book is for every male, but it's also for every female who wants to know what's going on with every male, or could be going on with every male. There are some people that aren't even conscious that this exists, and that's the whole idea, is to create awareness about the patterns that we've been living, how we've been brought up from kids, to be the way we are as males in society. But there is another option, and we're going to explore the new option today with Ed. Good day to you, Ed. How are you doing?
I'm good, Greg. Great to be here with you.
It's good to know that you're good in San Francisco. I'm going to let my listeners know just a tad bit about you. Ed Frauenheim was wrestled with, and it means to be what it means to be a man for 40 years. In his personal and professional life, as a young man, as an adult and a father, as an observer of the best workplaces in the world, and co-founder of a group trying to reinvent organizations. This book, to weave all these threads together, the man rules Ed grew up with weren't a good fit. Be strong. Ed was skinny, dominate others. He lost his fist fight in 6th grade. Just win, baby. We often freeze and during key moments of hockey, basketball, and soccer games. Ed's progress as a man owes partially to reinventing and learning about some of the most admirable men in business. Ed's the author who has written about organizations, leadership, and society for more than 2 decades. He currently serves as senior director, and he just said he's not doing that anymore, of the Great Places to Work. So he currently is just doing his work with this book, and he's writing. But
Yes.
Ed isn't done wrestling with what it means to be a man, but it's less a fight these days than it was before. And we're going to talk about that. And I think men in particular pay attention to this podcast because, it's a subconscious thing. I don't think many of us know that it's going on when you really begin to realize how subconscious it is. And in the foreword of your book, Paul Gilbert, the PhD, and I forget which university is from. Is he from, do you remember?
It's a British university.
Yeah. Any rate, it's okay. He writes that the basic nature as males has been deeply corrupted by modern culture. In what ways has our culture, modern culture, influenced us as males in your estimation?
Thanks, Greg. I love that forward by Paul Gilbert of the University of Derby. I just double checked that. The modern culture has influenced us as men to be more competitive, more dominant oriented, and to really lose our sense of egalitarianism. What Paul Gilbert pointed out, and I've done some of this research as well in terms of what we were like in our hunter-gatherer societies that really make up 95% or more of our human existence, is that men and women had strong values of autonomy, gratitude, and egalitarianism. And there's a lot of evidence that those kind of forager societies do not have the sort of hyper competitiveness that we see in basically what we would call civilized societies, where we're constantly feeling like there's a sense of scarcity, that we've got to fight to get ours, and that we seek to dominate others, and really not worry that there might have some that have a lot and others that don't have very much. So these are some negative influences that modern culture has really caused in men, but it's not the only way we've been as men. In fact, it's a relatively new way of being as men. Greg, I think you went onto mute there.
Sorry about that. We'll have to edit that. But I think what it is when I look at my almost 67 years on the planet, And I realized that in the last 20 years, that whole competitive nature of things became very exacerbated. We saw what seemed to me to be a speed up in our world. You call it what you want. The economy was going faster, technology was moving faster. We were moving faster as a species and trying to adapt and adopt new ways of doing and new ways of being, not only as men, but even women. I mean, if you took this same thing and you looked at women, the whole competitive nature of the world of women had changed drastically as well. Maybe the next book is reinventing women. And you mentioned
Mhm.
this book was written to take a look at the models of masculinity that consciously and unconsciously, as I said, our subconscious influence us. What were the positive and negative influences that you explored in your research for the book? Because you mentioned both.
Sure. We wanted to make clear that we're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, Greg, when we talk about what men have been like and the masculine models we've had. And there are positive traditional roles and ways of relating for men. We've been kind of given the option told to be providers, protectors, and conquerors in large part. And those can be noble identities to take on, to provide for our families and communities, to protect against trouble or hostility, and to conquer or achieve goals can be a very positive thing as well. At the same time, we've been told to be stoic. We've been told to be self-reliant, almost to the point of isolation, and those have a place as well, where you can sometimes it's important to bite the bullet and sort of be show endurance and toughness, and to be independent when that is an important thing to show up as. But these roles and these ways of relating are not complete as a human being, is what we argue in the book. They're out of balance, where we only see those limited roles to play and ways of working and relating to others. And it means that we've left out a lot of our humanity. We don't see ourselves as being able to play roles like the caregiver, like the spiritual seeker, the sensitive lover. These are more mocked or subordinate roles that we have a harder time playing. Nor do we have the ability to easily be emotionally available, given that we've been told to be stoic, and to see ourselves as interdependent, to recognize the ways we all need each other on the earth. So there are positives to that conventional masculinity, but there's also been a cost of a sort of a truncated version of humanity.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, as you were speaking there, I was thinking, just reflecting on the fact that as I look at my male counterparts and I look at people that I've worked in business with, and the other day I went up to one of my clients and I hugged him. But the reality is that he wasn't ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
And just to say, hey, Mike, I'd like to give you a hug.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the pressures you're under, lack of labor, can't find workers, trying to do the things you're trying to do. And it's almost like you see many people taking the weight of the world on their shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they're running companies. They're responsible as fathers, they're responsible as employers. Um, and the burden becomes pretty tough to actually get there. And you mentioned that this book was written for several audiences. I'd love to know who the audiences are and why you and your co-author were compelled to focus on reinventing masculinity. What really drove you guys to want to do this?
We were concerned that a lot of men were living lives that were not very full, and that collectively there was a way for us to help men live freer and more basically fuller lives for themselves and help all those around them as well. And when I say that, what I mean is that there's what we would call the confined masculinity that's been kind of governing us for centuries. And that goes back to those limiting roles and ways of relating I mentioned, Greg. And it is especially outdated, unhealthy, and even sometimes dangerous in the 21st century that's emerging. And so when we talk about these audience we're writing to, we're writing to kind of average men, as you put it, especially guys that are maybe in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s that grew up with those confined views pretty strongly, like myself. I'm 53. But we also had a focus of the audience of men at work. That's been the area that I've studied in my career as a writer and journalist. And that old way of operating as a man at work, it risks having men show up as rigid, cold, and isolated in a world that's really now calling for flexibility, warmth, and connection.
So important what you just said. I mean, I think that, you're saying men showing up at work. Okay, we spend the bulk of our waking hours at work. Most men, let's put it this way. To find the balance can be challenging because the pressure, as our good friend Amy Remy writes about, is being flexible, and the 8 superpowers to thrive is to be in flux. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot of men, I like what she says actually. If it's a change we make, we can deal with it. If it's a change that's thrust upon us, we resist it. You were, I'm going to say something personal. You just prior to this call mentioned that you'd had a heart attack last week, and we're all sitting here today. That wasn't something you planned. That was unexpected. And the consequences of that psychologically, emotionally, mentally are very tough. And then on top of everything else. So I applaud you in being here for this, because it could have been debilitating. So the point I'm making is, and the point that we have with Miss Rennie, is just being flexible. And you can't probably see that much in the workplace because of the pressure of what's going on. And your intention, you say in this book, is to advise and contribute to the public and personal narrative about men and masculinity. What is it that you see that are the expanded possibilities and the alternative ways to view our masculinity? I know you spoke briefly about them. We're going to find this kind of thing here, because one is a liberated masculinity and the other one is your confined masculinity. And if you look at the polar ends of each, one is expansive and one is contractive, right? Or contracting. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So go ahead and speak with our audience about that. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, that this alternative to the confined masculinity that we've identified is what we call liberating masculinity. And it is an expansive way of operating, way of being as a man. And basically it comes back to those roles and ways of relating again, Greg, that under a liberating masculinity, you are free as a man to take up alternative roles, not just the provider, protector, and conqueror, but things like caregiver. Especially during the pandemic, we saw men being called to often being caring for their kids more than perhaps they were in the past. To be open to alternative sexualities and gender identities. That is something that younger people especially are gravitating toward. It allows men also to move into the area of emotions and compassion and connection in ways that historically have been a little stilted, where men were, there's even a term for how men often lack the language of their feelings. because we've been told you're not, boys don't cry, you don't show emotion. But this liberating masculinity says, yes, we are emotional human social beings, and we're going to have feelings, and it's important for us to know them and express them if we want to have deep relationships with folks. So when we add all that up, it really allows us to live a fuller life as well as those around us. So we use that term liberating masculinity in two meanings. One is you're freeing yourself from those old confines, but you're then freeing others, your children, your spouse, those and your coworkers, so that they are able to be their full selves in the world as well.
Well, it is, again, the polar opposites, confined versus liberated. And there's a movement in between. There's a space in between those two. I don't think that people, just automatically move from confined to liberated. I believe that it's a gradual progression to actually get there, because you have to speak about your feelings. You have to understand that things have changed, and you have to be willing and aware of what needs to be changed. And actually, that awareness to just wake up that you've been acting in a certain way is really, really the important element of this book. It really makes you aware of ways you've been acting in a confined space versus a liberated space. And you and Ed Adams wrote about, you cited some alarming statistics gathered in 2018 and a survey from 538 is what you call it. Can you comment on these statistics and findings, and how our societal pressures are influencing these statistics? And I didn't want to cite any of the statistics, but as I read them, I was aware, but alarmed that it is actually as bad as it is.
Sure. Yeah. What we found in that study is that a majority of men feel that the society puts pressure on us in ways that are unhealthy. And it's actually a higher percentage when it's younger men. So younger men have greater awareness, as you're talking about, Greg, that we are being pushed in ways that are not good for us, or not good for our broader society. So I think there's a sort of a dawning understanding that these traditional expectations of us as men are not good ones.
Yeah, but
And behind
those pressures led to suicide rates beyond comprehension. Like 63%. I mean, it was very high.
right.
Suicide, depression, anxiety, health conditions. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. I was going to say I think the men who are saying that the pressures are unhealthy are vaguely aware that men commit suicide at much higher rates than women. They are much less likely to go to the doctor because they think they have to be tough. You mentioned my heart attack of last week, and I was wrestling with some of those same issues of, am I, being weak here to call the doctor when I'd had a kind of some chest pains, and was it maybe just something that I was letting stress get to me? Thankfully, I didn't listen to that. I went ahead and called the hospital and got, was asked to come in and had tests, and I turned out I did have a minor heart attack. And then even at that point, there's a need, I think, for men to let go a little bit, to let go of control, to surrender, to be cared for by others. That's part of that self-sufficiency point, the rugged individualism that we take too far often. And in fact, we are needing the help of others. And I certainly needed the help of amazing doctors and nurses at the Kaiser facility in San Francisco. I'm eternally grateful to them for taking care of me. But those are some of the ways in which these societal pressures are, you're supposed to buck up and just tough it out. And if I had done that, Greg, I might not be here today, honestly.
Well, they've always said this is, as long as I've been in this personal growth arena, there's two emotions, love and fear. And, fear, when it dominates you, whatever it might be, fear of money, fear of loss, fear of this, fear of that. When that is there, even this fear to express yourself the way you like to express yourself, um, because you hold back or you put it under the carpet. It's not healthy.
Yeah.
And so we see the manifesting of this dis-ease, dis
Mm.
hyphen EASE, manifests in many different ways. And your statistics cite that, whether it's in your case, a heart attack, or somebody with chronic back problems, or somebody who, has cancer, or
Hmm.
whatever it manifests into. And you speak with the listeners about, we say, liberated masculinity and the roles of compassion and connection. Now, what I'd like you to do, I know there's 5 C's, but we're going to talk about the first 2 C's now, and then we're going to add 3 more C's to this. But there's the compassion and connection is something that you really focus on in the book.
Hmm. Yeah, and we want to highlight the idea that men have shown compassion traditionally in ways that are largely implicit. Um, we may show compassion by being that provider for our family, for making sure that our kids have clothes and food and shelter and a good school. But what we've kind of missed out on is the importance of demonstrating compassion in explicit ways as well, and in deeper ways where we really are in tune to how others are feeling, and to our own feelings. And then we talk about the importance of self-compassion, so we aren't missing out on these signals that our health may not be good, for example, as we just were talking about, or to be acknowledging when we're feeling low or down. There's high levels of depression as well, and especially during the pandemic when we were stressed out. And we were talking about that, Greg. If men are not attuned to being compassionate, starting with themselves and moving out to others, it really limits our experience as people and limits our ability to relate deeply to others. And this is important not only in our lives at home, but also at work, because increasingly the work world is calling on men and all people at work to be more emotionally intelligent, to be aware of how our teams operate, because work is much more a team sport now, not just something you do on your own in your own cubicle, but in collective groups. And so if we are not creating the psychological safety that we know is important, and that requires that emotional intelligence, then we're not going to be very successful at work. And the connection piece is related. Of course, it's moving away from that idea that we are islands, unto ourselves, the self-sufficiency,
Siloed,
siloed
siloed.
people.
Yeah.
Yep. And that we actually are, have bonds that matter to us, that's part of our legacy as social creatures, as mammals, honestly. And we can acknowledge these bonds and deepen them, again, to have a richer life, better connections with our kids and our families, better relationships and success at work, and then allow all those around us to be more joyful and more soulful as well.
Well, and there's 5 C's here, but we've talked about 2. There's one that I would like to add because I actually think, and it's not one that's in your book, but I think when you talk about connection, you also have to have a level, and I don't know how to instill this in people, but the more curious you are about
Hmm.
anything, the more apt you are to make a connection, to try and find a partner, a solution, a somebody to help you navigate your level of curiosity into a new space. And I think that keeps the aliveness in people. If they really, Stephen Kotler's been on the show many times. The last book was The Art of Impossible, but he strung together what I would call the personal growth formula. And your book is under personal growth on the back. That's what it says. And,
Hmm.
he says you get focus for free, right? And then you have curiosity. And curiosity leads to a passion. Find out what those passions are that you have in life. 3 of them, he says, 2 or 3. Then
Hmm.
see how you can weave those together and then define a
Mm.
purpose that goes along with that. And then after the purpose, you now can create some goals around that. And you can then create proximal goals. And then what happens is you're driving toward that purpose after you've done those first 4 steps. You're literally now at a point where you've got these goals and you have to have grit and determination to see through the passion that you have. But if you want to
Mm-hmm.
live a life with passion, and I like the formula for personal growth because it's the same thing with this, I look at it on one end, confined masculinity versus the liberated one. The
Mm-hmm.
liberated one is actually finding your purpose, where the
Mm.
confined one, right, is somebody who doesn't have a purpose. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes they're just going through the steps in life,
Yeah.
right? And it becomes very drudgery. Now you have three more C's that I want you to talk about that are associated with liberating masculinity. We've covered two. What are the other three?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned curiosity, Greg. I couldn't agree more, because that is the first one we identify of the 5 C's, is getting curious about whether there are other ways of living as a man, whether there are being willing to ask more questions about life and about work, about anything really. We do agree that curiosity is vital, and that relates to the second one we have, which is courage. The idea there is to build on the courage that men have had and demonstrated for many years in the realms of like the physical, like running into a burning building to save someone, or financial courage to take a risk. But here we're talking about the courage to also go into the realm of the emotions, to feelings that may be difficult to experience in ourselves or to recognize in others, including even the shame feelings, like maybe we're not good enough as a guy. And that courage piece also includes even being willing to admit that we don't know all the answers. It relates back to the courage or the curiosity one, because if we show up and start asking questions, it can make us look vulnerable or weak.
Right.
But increasingly, we need to do that to succeed in our work worlds where things are changing so much, but also it helps deepen our relationships. And then the last one, beyond compassion and connection for us, is commitment, which relates, I think, to what you were saying about grit and determination. It's really sticking with this process, going through these, what we call these practices. Really, can we demonstrate these and develop habits of curiosity, courage, compassion, and connection? So that's the fifth one we identified as commitment.
Well, those 5 C's are at the essence of somebody transforming themselves into a liberated masculine person versus
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's confined. And while there may be awareness of the differences between it, the question is the practice of it. And, um, Ed, your partner, has a program that allows men to get together, and I wanted you to speak about that. And I think it's M3.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that at our blog, our listeners have an opportunity to go to that website, learn more about that. We'll definitely put up the website for the book, but we want to expose them that what we talk about here isn't something that's living just in the pages of this book. It
Mm-hmm.
can't. It has to be in small communities of people who get together and actually express their feelings about their current masculinity. Tell me a little bit more about Ed Adams's program and how our listeners could get involved.
Sure. It's the program is called Men Mentoring Men, or M3, and it is just a funnel group. I got a chance to meet some of the men of the group. It's been going on for about 30 years, Greg. It's touched hundreds of people's lives, mostly in the New Jersey, New York City area. But now they're doing virtual things, so it could be that people could join from all over the place. Or certainly my co-author Ed could give advice for people who want to maybe start their own group. But what's really amazing about the men in this group is that they come from all walks, many ages, and the one rule that my co-author Ed Adams set up at the beginning was no man shames another, because that has been such a source of grief and division among guys, where we mock each other, or we put each other down. This is a place that these men have created where men are supporting each other and sharing what's real in their lives. And I can tell you that they are the most a wonderful set of guys. They're not they're still guysy guys, if you will. They're razzing each other a little bit, teasing in just very kind ways, but also able to kind of get deep with each other on issues like illness, on divorce, on parenting, on work. They are, it's very inspiring to be around them. And we tell some of the stories in our book about some of these guys and how they transform their lives.
Yeah, and look, it's a great place. Even if we're going to put a link to it, but we'll also put a link to Ed Adams, the co-author, where you can get in touch with him. And if you wanted to form your own group, obviously he could probably give you the guidelines and practices for starting a group like this. But it's so needed, and I think no matter how you're doing it, where people can get together in community and express and share their thoughts and their feelings. And have someone deeply listen is so important to the healing process, because this is about the healing process as well. And you mentioned in the book that you state that confined masculinity, as you said earlier, you had 3 roles: were protectors or providers, conquerors. Got that. That's the one that we were brought up with. What are the new roles of someone who's adapted the liberated masculinity mindset?
Great. Yeah, great question, Greg. And one I'll mention that we've talked a bit so far about already is a caregiver role.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that we historically thought of as women's work, to be sort of either a full-time parent or a caregiver in the sense of being a nurse. And I can tell you, I just had the experience of being in the hospital with several male nurses who were just wonderful, and combined some of the traditional masculine identities, you might say, of being strong and assertive and take charge, along with the idea of being gentle and nurturing and caring. It just was neat to see. And there's an example in our book of one of the men mentoring men who had been, I believe he was an accountant for many years, but he'd always wanted to be a nurse. And with the support of the guys of Men Mentoring Men, they were like, you should follow your passion, to your point, Greg, of that path. And he's like, okay, I'm going to do it. And he became a nurse. And not only that, he quickly rose professionally. And he brought some of those same ideas that we should not shame each other and bring each other down to his workplace, because he noticed there was some dark humor that was going on in the emergency room with EMTs who were sort of callous about some of the patients. And this nurse, Paul, said, let's rethink this. We're bringing down, and we're being, being negative when we ought to be positive here in this healing area. So this caregiving role is really one that is surfacing, I think. And one other one that I'll mention that is important today in the workplace is also being an advocate and an ally. Because one of the things that Liberating Masculinity does is it allows you and really kind of prompts you to reflect on the privileges we've had as men. And that is not to say that we haven't worked hard and done good deeds in our lives to get to where we have gotten, but men have historically had benefits and advantages structurally over women, especially white men, if you think about people of color. And so if we're able to take a good hard look at ourselves and recognize, becoming aware of the ways we've had advantages, then we start realizing the need to lift up others, even as we progress. And that role of an ally and someone who's really willing to listen to those who've had a rockier time historically or wrestled with structural bias, that is a role that's really needed in workplaces today and increasingly expected. So those are two roles that I'd say are emerging and that are possible with the Liberating Masculinity.
Yeah, and I'd say that it's needed from a standpoint to be able to play the role and still have your masculinity, but your sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
your compassion, and actually playing both sides of that requires a tremendous amount of thought before words come out of your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And processing, take a deep breath, as they say, before you say something. If we were to wrap this thing up, and we were to put 3 things that you would like to leave our listeners with as takeaways, in them either changing from transmuting, transforming into becoming more liberated if they aren't at all. They're listening to this and they're saying, well, I'm the confined masculine person. That's the way I was brought up, and that's the way I'm going to stay till the end. But if there was something you could tell them, they would say, look, the world is better if you're playing a role as a liberated masculine person than as that confined person. What would you tell them?
I would tell them that there is a richer life possible. And I've seen it both in the stories in our book, The Men of M3, and in my own life. You mentioned at the beginning sort of the ways I didn't fit into that man box, that confined masculinity model very well, Greg, of being skinny, not being a winner of fights. I also didn't rise through the corporate hierarchy. I think I may have the smallest management career on record. I've managed one person for one day, it turns out, in my work life. And yet, when I sort of let go of some of those expectations and I focused more on purposeful work, on what was really going to create a more positive workplace experience for people in general, I found greater meaning and have actually found more success, ironically, by letting go of some of those older roles. So I would say there's a better life possible, a fuller life. And men can change. We have been different at different parts of human history and existence. And we're called to change these days.
Well, that's a great way to sum this up. And Ed, I'd like to say to both Eds, the other Ed isn't here. Thank you for writing this book, Reinventing Masculinity, the liberating power of compassion and connection. One, to create awareness about the issue. Two, to give people a pathway out of confined masculinity into a liberated masculinity. And three, to empower them with the tools, which is knowledge. Many times just the book itself is enough knowledge, but I am going to encourage people to find a way to meet with others who are maybe experiencing the same thing, because there's nothing better than coming together and as a group to discuss it and to get the support in that group arena. Ed, great having you on Inside Personal Growth. We will have the link to Amazon for this book. We will also have a link to the website for Ed Adams, the co-author, so that you can make a connection with him. And we'll have a link to the book website as well, all in our blog. Namaste to you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for taking this time with my listeners.
Thank you very much.